I'd like to present Dr. Ron Wakimoto from the University of Montana, where he received his BS in forestry and went on to Berkeley to get his MS and PhD in wildland resource science. He has been at the university since 1982, teaching and conducting research in wildlife fire management. He was part of a 5-day course on fire ecology and prescribed burning in Mongar, Bhutan. And let's see, in 2000 he gave testimony on the Montana fire fuel situation to the U.S. House Natural Resources Subcommittee on Forests and Forest Health. That's only about half of it, but I don't want to take up any more time. So I'd like to present Dr. Wakimoto.
Thank you. Well, I think that's when I think about it, and I had to give this presentation on federal fire policy at a teacher's workshop, I figured that I'd probably be latter in the class, or the last speaker instead of the first speaker, because I suspect that that's probably the last thing you thought about was the federal fire policy when you want to think about that at 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so I began to think about what I should cover here in this talk with respect to our policies, and I've kind of taken a little different tack. We'll end up talking about our fire policies and our current fire policy. I think that there's a lot of frustration for me. Here we are in the Forest Service Supervisor's office, but in reality, if you know much about our federal fire policy, we changed that policy in the middle of last summer, and we never told anybody. Okay? We still haven't told anybody. And a lot of things you see in the paper, the issues that brought up in just yesterday's editorial in the Missoulian, like what are they doing there on these fires in the Bitterroot? That fire was a perfect example of our national policy as it stands now, but the agency has yet to tell anybody about what it's like. Okay, I'll just have to say that. And you're hearing it from a skeptic. I was one of the 2 academics on the National Fire Policy Review Team following the '88 fires in Yellowstone. I've been giving testimony to Congress 3 times on wildland fire policy, and I now have a federal fire policy that is difficult for me to explain to students in my sophomore level class at the university. You have to know some history about it. So we're going to get there. You folks live in Montana. I don't think that it's a mind-boggling thing to think about fire as a natural process in the forest. We're going to have certainly some other folks talk about that today. But this is just an example of a surface fire. It's a kind of fire we were just talking about today. This is the kind of fire that's burning all those homes in Boulder right now. The houses are very flammable. If you see the pictures, you'll see the houses are burning and they're killing the trees. It's not the other way around, okay? So, but that fire was, people often talk about it as a natural process, and it certainly was in this part of the country. I'm going to try to, well, let's see. Now we're going to see if it goes backwards. It does. Yes, it works. Thanks, Dick. Appreciate it. We've done all this work by looking at fire scars. The very early works of many foresters and other scientists have taken portions of fire scars coming out of susceptible trees, like this piece of ponderosa pine. This is from Bandelier National Monument, but you can see these little black scars showing the periodic fires. And because we have annual rings between the trees put down annual rings, both spring wood, which is the larger, lighter colored wood here because the trees have a lot of water in those cells, so it looks light colored to us. And then we get a dark color as the trees run out of water. So we have that kind of record in the trees of how many years between successive fires. We can count that. We can average that if you're looking for math kinds of topics and things. And you can get at what we call a mean fire interval, the average number of years between fires. And people have probably been exposed to that quite frequently here. When we look at that, what's interesting is that when we're in Montana, we find this dichotomy where we have For example, I guess the clearest example we have close by is to look at Paddy Canyon. Jim Habeck did a wonderful study of Paddy Canyon, and he showed that from about 1600 to about 1850, Paddy Canyon had a mean fire interval, as witnessed by the trees, of about 8 years. 8 years between fires. Since 1850, there's been one fire. Since 1850, not 1910, not when the Forest Service was created in 1905, but since 1850, we've had one fire. 1977 Paddy Canyon fire that destroyed homes and pretty high intensity fire. There have been a few others in that, but nothing of any large significance. And you begin to wonder, well, hey, wait a minute. Here's a place that burned that frequently, and the record in the tree shows that. Oh, great. And I hope you'll question, like, how can that be? That a place can burn that frequently from 1600 to 1850 and then stop. Long before we had people running around here putting out forest fires. Okay? And the real reason, of course, is that we eliminated Native American burning, and I want to talk about that as a precursor to this idea of policy, because there's this fallacy, this myth that's out there that no one was here prior to 1805, you know, in this wonderful Lewis and Clark story, but like no one was here manipulating the landscape, changing the landscape actively so they could live here. And here's this wonderful picture. This is a mock-up on the prairies in Canada. And it's kind of this neat picture, you know. It's got them lighting the fire, and this fellow's standing here with the horses with his rifle. And they're lighting the grassland, and people are going, oh yeah, you know, you light the grassland. There's all that nice story about the blackened soil heating up earlier in the season, so we get greener grass, great for the buffalo. You know, it's all there. But here's a very similar painting. This is a Charlie Russell. And it kind of shows the similar things. The fellow's here looking back, and he's looking back tentatively over his shoulder, and this fellow's lighting the fire. And I guess I'd say this is a wonderful picture for me because Charlie Russell got it right. This is a painting called Blackfeet Burning Crow Winter Range. Think about that. You know, we often think of this benign use of the wild land so they can live there, but in reality this was part of war. They wanted those people to starve. They wanted that big black area so the bison didn't go there, so the crow could have nothing to eat. Right? It's part of, it's a much more complicated story than we want to think about. We talk about native use of fire. Part of the problem is that we've had this real racial bias about Native people in the application of fire. Here's a California Division of Forestry quote from 1959 from Ray Clark. Said it would be difficult to find a reason why Indians should care one way or another if the forest burned. It's quite something else again to contend that the Indian use of fire used fire systematically to improve the forest. Improve it for what purpose? Yet this fantastic idea has been and is still being put forth time and again. This was the attitude of that generation of foresters about fire in the forest. And we're going to come back to California. That's, you know, we're in Montana. We're used to thinking about big, wide open spaces. Imagine dense native populations trying to live in a place like California where the winter doesn't kill part of that population. It's a very different thing. So, but there are people whose careers ended because they thought Native people used fire in California. There are many academics who were blackballed, so they had to leave the country, literally, to be able to do their science because of this kind of belief about that no one was here before European settlers came. Daniel Botkin made this comment in '95. It often seems that the common impression about the American West is that before the arrival of people of European descent, Native Americans had essentially no effect on the land, the wildlife, or the ecosystem, except that they harvested trivial amounts that did not affect the natural abundance of plants and animals. He goes on to say, but Native Americans had three powerful technologies: fire, the ability to work wood into useful objects, and the bow and arrow. There is ample evidence that Native Americans greatly changed the characteristic of the landscape with fire, and that they had major effects on the abundance of some wildlife species through their hunting. And I guess I want to emphasize that again. We're going to kind of touch on that a little bit, but it shows us just where we are relative to our ideas about fire policy. And I emphasize this because our national fire policy is still written as if no one else was here before 1805. It's not recognized in our national policy. There's literature that the agency puts out that talks and it says that Native people were here, but not that they actively managed the landscape, that they created a landscape so they could live here. And that's what I hope everyone here would like to have, is in Montana, a reasonable landscape so we could live here. We have different objectives, different timing of our use of land, different ways that we use land, and yet we're still looking for that landscape. And part of the blinders that keep us from looking at how we might create that landscape is this idea that no one was here and that no one had any effect prior to European man coming to this site. In fact, this is another Jerry Williams. It's interesting, we have a Jerry Williams who was here in Montana. He lives here in Missoula yet. He just retired from the Forest Service, where he was the Director of Fire and Aviation Management. This is another Gerald Williams who's also retired. He was the main anthropologist and historian for the Forest Service, particularly in Region 6 in Oregon and Washington most of his career, but then moved to Washington, D.C. to the Washington office. When the early settlers arrived, they often found a landscape almost devoid of Indians, but rich in big game, with millions of acres of prairie grasslands and open forests scattered throughout North America. What many believed to be natural was actually the results of purposeful environmental change. That those huge grasslands that became farms in some areas of this country, not the central part of that country, but in the East Coast as well as the West Coast, were really grasslands created by repeated Native American use of fire. All right. And I'm not going to bore you with these. We might hit on a few reasons for burning. You know, we often think about how that could be very simplistic, and in other places it was very complicated. Hunting, burning of large areas to divert game to unburned areas. I had the privilege of going to Yellowstone in '88 and seeing the unburned patches of grass in the Lamar Valley full of mice, and watching a smiling coyote just sit there because he knew they're right there. There's just this unburned patch, okay? And just take a flying leap right in the middle of it. That's what they just jump in the air and dive headfirst into that patch, okay? Crop management. You know, people lived off the land. They had to be able to manage the berries. They wanted to get at seeds that were often covered with a lot of organic material. They lit these fires to live on the land. There were a wide array of reasons why they used fire. Collecting insects, primarily here for food, to harvest honey. I don't know how many, do we have any beekeepers here? You know, when you hit them with the smoke and how they react so differently than you would think they would in terms of those bees. Clearing areas for travel. Egress is very important when you're walking. This is long before the horse. People here in this part of North America were certainly here for the last 13,000 years. They didn't get the horse till about 1700. And interestingly enough, when Steve Arno tested some of these ideas where he looked at mean fire intervals, that number that we talked about, that average number of years between fires. And he looked at mean fire intervals in areas along the road to the Buffalo that were pre-1700 and post-1700. He found no difference, no significant difference in the mean fire intervals. Okay? So they were burning for a lot of other reasons than just food for the horses as they moved along the trail. How many here have read Undaunted Courage? Yeah, when you read that book, you realize that, you know, when they were coming back, the Nez Perce said, oh yeah, we're going to have to go for it, day and a half. But when we get there, there's going to be grass for the horses and there's going to be water. You know, how do they know that? Well, families had been doing it for thousands of years, but they knew there were going to be grass there because they lit it on fire when they left. Okay, so there was active manipulation for travel, egress, particularly blowdown in lodgepole pine, clearing of riparian areas. Come on. Oh. Well, there's a whole variety of reasons, and I know we've got to try to get caught up with some time here. This kind of a tough shot, but this is, I wanted to talk about it because people often, you know, we come to Montana. I'm one of those that's, I can say I'm smart enough to be from California. You know, I got here. People from a lot of parts of this country don't think there was much fire. This is the Shenandoah. And it's quite interesting to me that, you know, just so you think about fire on the East Coast, which is a little harder thing because it's all person caused. In 1760, the colonies of New England, New Jersey, and New York had written laws outlawing Native American burning. In 1760. People were actively burning, and they weren't thinking about, oh, do we burn this now? They're burning every bit of grassland to open that forest up. Automatically every year. We did, if you look at historic records of Native Americans in Oregon, the Willamette Valley, all these places, every year they fired that grassland. And that provided ignition sources that in some drought years might create very significant differences in forest cover in different parts of the country. And I show the Shenandoah here because it's all forest covered and shrub covered now. In 1760, that same time when those laws were passed, the Shenandoah Valley was claimed to be an enormous grassland. 150 miles long, 10 miles wide, grassland. By the turn of the century in 1800, now we were a country then, of course, when they were mapping the country, the resources of the country, the map makers no longer call it a grassland. By 1800, because of the change in vegetation, that this was ecologically capable of supporting grasses, trees and shrubs, a forest cover, and we took that influence of Native people out. That's why I started off to talk about this, that people actively manipulated this land with fire, and it was a very different landscape in the Shenandoah. Here's a longleaf pine. During that period of time, at one time they expected there to be about 11 million acres of longleaf pine in the southeast part of the United States. Just in the last 5 years, the Nature Conservancy has instituted a whole big program on the restoration of longleaf pine. There's almost extinct, in that sense of restoration of these forests that were part of the South. And of course, what happened here is that, and we'll come there, our policies in 1935, we began what we called, and we'll come back to this, the 10 a.m. policy, where all fires would be put out by 10 a.m. the following day, okay? And it took from 1935 to to 1943, for the southern foresters, the silviculturists, that's a art and science of growing trees, okay, silviculture. It took them that period of time to convince the Forest Service, their own agency, that they couldn't grow longleaf pine if they didn't light fires, okay, because it was against policy. All fires were bad, okay? All fires were supposed to be suppressed. And it took them from 35 to 43, huge battles, meetings within the agency to say, oh yeah, I guess we should prescribe burn in these kinds of forest stands. And so what happens then? Well, we don't really want to light those fires because it's against our policy, so we won't plant any longleaf pine. We'll convert to species that can grow without putting fire in the stand. If you know anything about this wonderful tree, the tree often grows 10 to 15 years in what's called the grass stage. It stays about this tall, has a huge bud that's protected by the needles, and the tree is building a root system for those 10 or 15 years. And it just sits in the grass stage, in the grassland for that period of time. And then if a fire comes along at that period of time, then the tree grows 3 or 4 feet a year after that. Okay? Kind of tied into that in terms of that occurrence of fire. 11 million acres to a situation now where we're trying to restore longleaf pine in the South. So people were an active part of that as well. They created the ignitions and regularly burned these types. Another different stand of longleaf with a little more shrub in it. And then of course you come to the West, and all of you folks have, we hear this all the time, that the forests are now overgrown, changes in species composition, crowding out the large ponderosa pine, producing the ladder fuels. I think you've all been exposed to those ideas that allows the surface fire to climb into the trees to kill the large trees. And we often consider that a Western problem. I hope you realize that it's a nationwide problem because of our federal fire policy. Omar Stewart, and it says 2002, he was long dead by then. Omar Stewart published, who is an anthropologist, published a number of excellent descriptions of Native American use of fire, but he did that in the 50s. And I hope you realize that in the 50s, that was the heyday of Smokey the Bear. You know, we all sang songs and all that stuff in school. And because of that, his work was always suppressed. Active suppression. In fact, there is a book called, by Ansley Shift, called Fire and Water Scientific Heresy in the Forest Service, because a Forest Service scientist could not say anything good about fire, and of course you couldn't let academics say that fire was a natural part of our system, or a part of our system that Native Americans actively manipulated the landscape. And so his work was suppressed. It wasn't until 2002 it became socially acceptable to say those things. And Cat Anderson at UC Davis and, oh, I can't think of his name, all of a sudden I can't. One of my friends who had to go to Canada because he said the same thing about California in the 70s. He had to go to Canada to join the faculty there, an anthropologist. Can't think of his name. Well, all right, we'll come back there. But here's what he said. Complete fire prevention does not appear to be a proper idea in the California forests any more than those in Washington, New Jersey, or Louisiana. Okay, because people were trying to live on the land actively using fire. And there might not be this, you know, here in Montana, lightning, you know, lightning will be that kind of fire ignition. But Patty Canyon's had one fire since 1850, okay? So certainly the ignitions that Native Americans bring about or put on the landscape really did change that nature of the forest that we have there. Let's see if I think this is an important point for me. It says, generally, the American Indians burned parts of ecosystems in which they lived to promote diversity of habitats. Okay, that's the other side of the coin. Diversity of habitats, especially increasing the edge effect, which gave the Indians greater security and stability to their lives. Their use of fire was different from white settlers who burned to create uniformity in ecosystems. Right? So you do find that now we're all tied to particular prescriptions for burning, and we wait and we wait and we wait until we get those particular conditions to try to make that forest relatively uniform. The diversity of fuels is going to give us some diversity, but the native people were working that particular edge to create that diversity of habitat. So even when white settlers took on this role of being the ignition source because they saw it work for the native people who lived there, they were still looking at uniformity of the system, not diversity of the system, because they weren't trying to eat those berries right at the top of the canyon, or to have a particular area where they could shoot down to get deer who would move through a particular area, as opposed to the settlers. And that complication here, I don't want to bore you with these kind of quotes, but Baptiste Ritchie was those are informants. If you look at anthropological literature, they're all called informants. He was talking to Turner in 1991. He says, if you go to burn, then you get into trouble because white men want to grow trees. Okay? Native people, the trees were there, they utilized the trees, but they weren't burning to manage trees for the most part. They were burning to create edges of grasslands where they could live, where they could get that advantage. Because they changed our ways, they do good for us, and we eat the food that the white man used. Then we forget the good foods of our earliest forefathers. Now they have all disappeared. The food has disappeared because the hills are growing weedy and no one seems to tend them. This is the choice of words, tend them. No one cleans them the way our forefathers did so thoroughly. So native people really, when we talk about attachment to land, they had to manipulate particular places. Now, in Montana, we're still talking about big, wide open spaces. So this was done, but not to the degree that you might find in other places, and particularly places like California, where it was very important. Oh, great. So I'm going to say that ecosystems that Europeans first witnessed in North America were natural. That's the big myth. And that their structure and functions were maintained with minimal or no human influence. Okay? That is a myth. And part of that, and I will say it here because this, you know, I'm the academic and this is a group of teachers. A lot of that comes from our guilt, I think, in a way that comes from the 1864 publication called Man and Nature by George Perkins Marsh. It's a wonderful read. It's an incredible publication. But what he did is, this is a man who was I think he was our Secretary of Agriculture at one time, but a very influential, well-educated person who went to Europe and saw how the societies in the drier parts of the Mediterranean, in Greece and in other areas, had literally denuded the forest by cutting them down, by changing the water tables, and destroying the forest. And so he created this sense that man is always the destructor of nature, and brought that and published that, and it had a great deal of effect on the American psyche about this forest that we have, because we were cutting the forest down like crazy. We're actively, you know, there's a reason why Gifford Pinchot really became a big hero in that sense, that he brought this whole idea of conservation, of growing forest, as the first head forest chief of the Forest Service, because it fit the ideas that people had in their minds that, boy, we shouldn't be cutting all these trees down, that we really are converting the forests, that we could destroy our natural resources by cutting those forests down. So people have had that feeling, and then to combine that with this idea that no one was here, it just fit. That we should save the forest, that we wanted the trees, and that no one was here actively manipulating the landscape. So I did want to bring that out here. It came together with this all at that time of the turn of the century. Forest Service was created in 1905. Ken Anderson finally concluded, and this is a scientist, a USGS scientist at UC Davis, the notion of pristine wilderness areas where passive Indians wandered and collected resources is being dismantled as more people begin to recognize that many ecosystems were profoundly influenced at each level of biological organization by Native American land uses and management techniques. And what we have is a body of science coming on that really is kind of attacking this whole idea that big myth, that no one was here. I have to throw this quote in here. This is by Luther Standing Bear, one of my heroes. It says, "Only to the white man was nature a wilderness, and only to him was the land infested with wild animals and savage people." Okay? Luther Standing Bear, Oglala Sioux, is an actual wonderful character when you read about him. Here he is. We're talking about one of the very first graduates of Carlisle College. Okay? I mean, and he ended up writing 3 different books about the Lakota Sioux. They're still available, paperback now, but it's talking about how did they live, their organization, that they weren't, quote, savage, they just had different gods, or a different god than the foreigners, the Europeans that were coming to America. And I always get a kick out of this because I look at Luther here as he's graduating in an older age. But you just think about getting out of Carlisle College in, I think, 1908 or something like that, as an educated Native American. What could he do? Who would hire him? You know? Pretty tough deal. So he was a smart guy. He thought about, well, what can I do as an educated Native American that kind of, you know, still puts me on the spotlight where I can talk to people, have some credibility about Native American life, how that was, because he was born before before the Custer battle. Well, what did he do? He was smart. He thought, what can I do being a college graduate? So he went to Hollywood and became an Indian. I mean, you think about that. What could you do if you graduated from college at that time, at the turn of the century, and he was smart enough to do that, okay? Made a lot of money, became, you know, pretty wealthy, returned to the reservation, and began to see these major changes in the society that he knew as a child versus what was happening now as they became so dependent on the whole reservation system. So he wrote about that. Pretty good read if you have students that might be interested in that. He also said this, when the very animals from the forest began fleeing from his approach, then it was for us that the Wild West began. I don't know how many, if you've ever seen archery hunters, there are many, you know, my students are active hunters in the College of Forestry and Conservation. And you can often shoot a number of arrows at a deer or an elk before it runs because it's very quiet. And instead now, they're being replaced with firearms, the big boom. And the great response, and that's what he was talking about here, is that, you know, when we live there, they're used to our smells, they're used to all this stuff, and all of a sudden now, we can't live here off the land because animals are fleeing from us. Can't get close enough anymore because these guys are shooting rifles at them. Okay, so it's a very different, he said that's when the Wild West began because people began to starve. They could no longer live off the land where they were used to hunting. Boy, we got to move here. If we're going to get to just that last part of policy, I have to put this fellow in. This is the last, what they call the last wild Native American in the history of the world, of the United States. This is Ishi. He stumbled out in 1911 in Orville, California. He spoke no English words. He knew no English words. He knew no Spanish words. And he was part of a particular tribe that had chosen to hide away. They actively hid away for many, many years. Alfred Kroeber, the anthropologist at the University of California at Berkeley, realized that, well, I guess I should say University of California at San Francisco. The anthropology museum was across the way, next to the Med Center at that time. And when this was reported, when the sheriff arrested this fellow, he didn't do anything wrong, but they put him in a cell to keep other people from harming him, actually. They called Kroeber, luckily, and Kroeber even knew which tribe, which little sub-tribe he was from, because he knew that these people had actively hidden away. And you have to understand, in California, his tribe was actively hunted by the people who now owned the land. They weren't put on reservations, they were just shot. So, let's get this, come on. And he was a Yahi. This is part of the Yana lands right here in California. Kroeber figured that in this little piece of Yahi land, when the 49ers first came to California and began to look for gold all across the Sierras, there were still 2,000 or 3,000 people living in that little piece of land, okay, in California. And in California, you have such an environment that you don't have the winter mortality that you could have here. In Montana, if you didn't have your act together, you would starve, or you'd freeze to death. California, why are there millions of people there? It's a nice place to be in terms of environment. And so these people, by 1800, California was absolutely fully occupied by native people. Fully occupied, because there's none of these density independent factors to kill them, like those cold winters. And so the Yahi could not move north because there was a tribe a parallel tribe, but they didn't want to give them food. They didn't want them to take their deer or their berries or anything. And they couldn't go down into the valley because the wind tune here would beat them up or kill them, because that valley land was really valuable because that's better agriculture, okay? So they were really stuck in that little place, and they had to actively manipulate the land to make a living. They did little fires, they managed their berries, they tended the forest the way that one fellow talked about. It's not this Montana broad scale kind of idea of fire, but actively manipulating little stands so that little family could live, find food, maintain themselves. And there's a wonderful book called Ishi, A Man of Two Worlds, by Theodora Kroeber. Kroeber's wife wrote a book just as actually Kroeber was passing away. But she wrote this wonderful book. It's in some ways sad, but within a year, Ishi, who came out of that land, was riding trolley cars in San Francisco and buying his own food and doing all the stuff. And then he would come back to the museum, change his clothes into his Native American costume, and then carve or chip flint, arrowheads for kids as part of the display. Thousands of people went there to see Ishi. Unfortunately, of course, he died of tuberculosis within another year. Yeah.
How do you spell Ishi?
I-S-H-I. And that's just a made-up name, because his own tribe and the way the Yana worked is that you never mentioned your own name. You never said your own name. You listened, you responded to your own name, but you never told anybody, this is my name. Okay, and nobody else understood that but Kroeber. So he realized this guy's never going to tell us his real name, so they made it up. So that it's a newspaper deal, right? The reporters were asking, what's his name? What's his name? So they made it up. And it stands for man in Yana. Okay. Okay. Step back a little bit. We'll come back to Lewis and Clark, because it is Montana. It's a wonderful story of Lewis and Clark moving through Montana. It's interesting that some scientists have gone back and began to look at the journals of Lewis and Clark and do some different kinds of analyses. This is an example of Charles Kay's work at the University of Colorado. Kind of a rough work. It's kind of interesting that, and I'll talk about this rough work by looking at the journals. It has since then been redone by scientists bringing the modern science of GIS and different kinds of ways of doing the analysis. And interestingly enough, they found the same thing that Charles Kay found. And what this is, these are days of the trip as the party, in this case, is coming from the east to the west. And each day, the hunting party, there are, 32 guys, and they sent out a hunting party every day. And for wildlife scientists, that's like a snap trap. Snap trap of, you go out and you use snap traps to look at mice populations and trap again to see how many you get. And each day is this snap trap of the wildlife populations that are in front of these travelers as they're moving through. So what Charles Kay did is he looked at these days, and at the same time the journals recorded how many Native Americans, how many Native people they'd run into in that day. Okay, because the journals would record that. And so what he found was this negative relationship between how many people, the Omahas and the Audis here as they moved in this direction, and where the bison and where all the wildlife were, because the numbers would go up in their kill. Okay? And what he found was that the more people he met, the fewer wildlife was there. I hope that makes sense, that these people were eating those wildlife. And that as you went towards the Yankton Sioux, this is disputed territory. There's no line on a map that, the people honored. They were out there hunting, and as you got out here, you would worry about, God, am I going to run into another warring party, another party that's hunting, and are there going to be more of them than me? All right? And so, just like in the DMZ in Korea, the highest wildlife populations are in that demilitarized zone because no one goes out there. Okay? And that's what's happening here. And they got all the wildlife, the bison. I forget what it took. 2 elk, a bison, and so many deer daily to feed those 32 guys. It's absolutely remarkable. They ate, I think the estimates are 8 pounds of meat a day. That's a protein diet, and you go, wow. But it was something like that. And so you see this pattern across the landscape, and this is what we were talking about, is this influence of Native people. This is 1804. And their effects on wildlife populations as witnessed by the Lewis and Clark journals. Being a scientist, Charles Kay went and looked at other issues as they continued to move here, more days, moving across the landscape. And as they came from the Teton Sioux, again, here's this high population, few people. These are pretty fierce fighters here, so people stayed away. And all of a sudden here, there is a confederation, an agreement between these two tribes. There's not a lot of wildlife here because you didn't have to worry when your hunting party went out in terms of finding animals. So as long as that confederation held, there were much lower populations. Okay, so that showed in the journal records. And then as they moved again, here's Mandan Hidatsas. Again, those issues, border dispute, larger wildlife populations. Okay? And as I said, there are other studies now where they've actually used this more as a GIS and kind of a buffered system and moved across the landscape, again using the journal records to show that Native people in 1804, 1805, 1806 had tremendous influence on wildlife populations. We want to think, if you read the journal or you read Undaunted Courage, that the group moved into the cornucopia of bison, they had no problems. But as they actually look at the record, there are some people who felt that had, and I guess I should throw this in, there were major, the diseases that the Spanish introduced to the Southwest eventually got here and decimated populations. That's why there were empty Mandan villages that were witnessed in that journal, because of the loss of people. There are people who figured that Lewis and Clark might not have made it across Montana or parts of the West because they'd have run out of trinkets to buy food. Okay? Because everybody was really harvesting food. So let's finally get to federal fire policy. And I don't want to dwell on a lot of this. I'll simplify some of it. But essentially, the 1910 fire, the fire that we're here to talk about in some ways today, really did spur things on. Ehlers Koch, who was the supervisor and the main organizer for the Forest Service, at least on this side of the mountain. We have Koch Peak in the Bitterroot, named after him. He organized that group, and essentially from 1910 to 1935, I'm going to use this term, economic suppression, and there are other writers who will have different ways to describe that. But essentially, it was a period where the higher the timber value, the money in the bank, the more effort was put into protecting those trees. Okay? The grass, the brush, probably not a lot of effort unless it was going to go into high-value timberlands. Okay? And we did organize then. 1910 was a very different issue in terms of the agency, in that we began to the agency began to hire people from outside who weren't Forest Service, meeting all those other standards, people to fight fire. If you know, and I guess you will learn, 1910 was a tremendous drought, much more severe drought than '88 here, at least in terms of Montana. It was a drought on the Palouse Prairie where the wheat grew up about less than a foot and then died because of the lack of water. So it was a very serious drought. Because of that, there were many, many migrant workers who were following the harvest of the wheat crop at that time. It's a hand deal at that time. They were able to come and to fight fire, right? That's why we had a source of people. But essentially, if we were talking about federal fire policy, it was that we would protect the money in the bank. In Montana, we had a number of private organizations. The Blackfoot Forest Protective Association protected over 1 million acres of the Blackfoot drainage. Private, nonprofit, corporation, set up by Anaconda Mining. I hope that makes sense, because Anaconda wanted the straight timbers for their mines. So they had to protect that money in the bank. So we didn't have the government organization and structure to protect those forests. And it was private forests. So they created this nonprofit organization. Some of you know that building, that River City Bar and Grill, that brick building, that's the headquarters of the BFPA. That's why it's a brick building out there. Okay. We also had the Northern Montana Forestry Association, centered around Kalispell. They protected, I think, over 2 million acres around Kalispell. Both those organizations, there was one in Anaconda for a little period of time too, but essentially the NMFA, the Northern Montana Forestry Association, from 1910 till 1970 protected that whole area around Kalispell. Private, nonprofit corporation. Timber barons created that to protect the money in the bank. Okay? It's part of Montana history that kind of interesting relative to this period of time. In 1935, because of the Depression, and it will make it kind of simple, that because of the Depression, we had a large number of young men who were used to building all these CCC things. They're part of the Civilian Conservation Corps. They were available to fight fire. We were also fighting blister rust at that time, a disease of the five-needle pines, the western white pine, sugar pine in California, white bark pine. Yeah. And so we had a force now in the woods, and the Forest Service changed their policy And it was enforced from 1935 to 1978, and that's what we would call the 10 a.m. policy. You'll find some places where they talk about it starting earlier than that, but essentially the written policy, I was startled when I read it. At Berkeley, you have the access to certain kind of documents, and 5100 in the Forest Service manual has that fire policy, and it simply said all fires will be controlled by 10 a.m. the day following the report. That one sentence, that's it. I thought there'd be, paragraphs about how we do this, but it's that one sentence, okay? That's a 10 a.m. policy. And so all fires were to be suppressed by 10 a.m. on the day following the report. And if that didn't happen, you went for it again to put that fire out. And it was all fires, at least that was the intent. And we did that until 1978. And we did that until 1978. A number of forces were happening. First, the academic world was showing that there was a whole lot of important ecological reasons why we ought to have fire on the landscape. Bob Mutch just walked in, one of our speakers this afternoon. Bob was the one who actually helped break this policy, in that he was the one in the Selway Bitterroot actually watching that fire in 72? Yeah. Watching that fire burn in 72, it took the chief of the Forest Service's signature to allow that fire to burn that Bob monitored. Okay, way back then. And by 1978 then, the preponderance of evidence, the science, allowed us to get away from just the 10 a.m. policy, right? And I guess, 78 to 95, I guess I don't have another term for it. You won't find it in any textbooks. I don't think the agencies called it much of anything. But 78 to 95, I'm just going to say revised fire policy. That was a period where we had wonderful terms. Some of you may remember we had terms called prescribed natural fires, where we allowed lightning-caused fires to burn. And we had the term wildfire, which meant that that was an unwanted event. Okay, it was an unwanted event. And we had prescribed fires under this definition in this policy that could be manager-ignited or ignited by lightning. Okay, and it was still called a prescribed fire. It was a management action. In 1995, and again in the middle of a fire season, they changed the terms, and I don't know what kind of policy to call it, because it only lasted for this period of time, although that's a pretty good chunk of time, I guess, for a fire policy, where we had what we would term, we no longer had prescribed natural fires. We had what we called wildland fire use to substitute for that. We're in primarily wilderness areas or outside the wilderness. If we did the proper planning, we could allow fires to burn for resource benefits. And we had the term, we created the term in 95, in July of 95, of wildland fires. Okay? In fact, wildland fires superseded wildfire, and we weren't supposed to call anything a wildfire. That was a historic non-use term. It is what states used, but the federal government was not supposed to use the term wildfire through this period of time. And I know it's disjunct a little bit, but it's this history of, we wanted to put more fire in the landscape. It was how to get there, and to create a landscape that was less flammable by allowing pieces of it to burn. And now our present fire policy, as I said, changed in the last summer, and no one has told anybody that it's changed. One of the key parts of this fire policy, this one with the question mark, is that when you had a fire, you had only one objective. And it could be use as an objective, where you allowed that fire to burn, or it could be a suppression objective. Okay? But you had to have only one objective for that fire, and that dictated the array of management actions you could take on the fire. I don't want to, if it sounds like a lot of semantics, that's what tends to be now important in our fire policy. So finally in July, last summer, without telling anybody, and as I said, they still haven't told anybody, we now have on the web what I'm just going to call guidance. Because if you don't see that word guidance, it means it's the wrong policy. Okay? There's an identical document that was written in '95 that talks about the implementation of the National Fire Policy and the National Fire Plan. But if it doesn't have the word guidance in, it's dated. It's no longer in force. Okay? We're currently under this national policy of guidance where we have wildland fires and we have prescribed fires that are manager ignited. That's the two kind of terms we can have. Either a wildland fire or a prescribed fire that is a management ignited fire. The hook now is we no longer have use fires. Okay? We no longer have that substitute for prescribed natural fire. What we do now have is a wildland fire, and we can manage it for multiple objectives. So on one portion of the fire, we can look at it as more of this natural process, restoring nature, restoring fire to the landscape under this guidance, and have full suppression on the side facing Hamilton. Okay? What I will tell you is that they never told us that they changed that policy, but that fire that we do talk about that happened last year in the Bitterroot is a perfect example, I believe, of our national policy. Okay? There are other issues here. It allows, but no one's been told that that is our policy, that we can have different objectives on different parts of that fire. We can manage that fire for different objectives, not just one. That's a major change. So this is what we've come to. And I'm not passing it out, okay? And I guess I don't like standing here, but we have now, and it was quite interesting because Bob and I have fought these battles before talking about terminology. Now we have what's called a unplanned ignition or a wildfire. Remember, wildfire was not supposed to be a term we used, but we use it now. There was a time when unplanned ignitions, that was only a Park Service term. Because it says unplanned, that means it's lightning. I hope you're following me there, okay? Lightning, as opposed to planned, which is the manager. Does that make sense? Huh?
Let me just say, lightning.
Hey.
Peeps.
Hey. Well, it could be people here too, I guess, for this unplanned. I'm sorry. Yeah, it could be people too. All right? But that planned and unplanned, there was always debated within the agency because they didn't want to use the term because there's a hell of a lot of planning done before you let a fire burn. I hope you understand that. Okay? But, so that's why they didn't want to use the term. Now, this is national fire policy. It includes all the agencies, and so some agencies had different say. And so we do have this unplanned ignition. It could be people or lightning, and a planned ignition, which is the manager igniting that fire. And you know, we go through a planning process, whether the plan's in place. It allows for protection objectives only. That would be the suppression part of it. The face, you know, depending on where we are in the Bitterroot, as an example. And if it's just for protection, then we have a pre-planned response. That's the initial attack. To suppress that fire, we implement that attack, and we see if we've achieved the objectives, whether the fire went out or not. If it does, we do write the fire report. If it doesn't, objectives not met, right? Then we come back, we do develop response through decision support processes, and we look at, you know, that how difficult it is to put out that fire, what resources are available. Okay? And I don't know that I'm doing the thought process here justice, but I think you can see why it's hard for me to explain to sophomore level students in college. Okay? You have to know the history of this whole process. So I'll be around. It's kind of a quick run through it, but this is where we are. Okay? Multiple objectives for that fire. Okay? That's Still that wildfire, but we have multiple objectives as opposed to just one. All right. I think that's...
Ron, before you click on, okay.
Oh, yeah.
The paragraph at the top just said that it's generally applicable in most situations, but most agencies, but then however specific exceptions may exist.
Yeah. Well, that's because there are historic fire management plans that are written for particular parks, for example, that might incorporate a lot of this different use. Okay.
So when they're talking about for
Or different
applicable to
wilderness
most
areas.
agencies, you're talking, for example, Forest Service, State Forest
No,
agencies, and
no,
so forth, BLM.
no, don't include that. I appreciate you saying that, Keith. Don't put the state in this at all.
Oh, okay.
Okay? State is, yeah, state is, this is federal fire agencies, so it's the BLM, the BIA, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service primarily, and the National Park Service. Okay? State organizations, they're out there to protect private land, and they have that suppression objective. So you will see this clash at boundaries. You know, when the Missoula State Forest was burning, very different ways to view what's going on in terms of the state's resources, the school trust lands, the timber on that school trust land.
Is there any kind of a set policy that when there is that clash between federal and state as to who actually gets to take jurisdiction on it?
Well, it depends on whose land it started on, but there's also a way to come in at a higher level to discuss that, yeah, in terms of the management organization for the fire. Yeah, that's an important point. But it really is depending on whose land it starts on. Yeah. The National, or the Association of Western Governors is very concerned because of these changes in our national fire policy, and you can kind of sense that. That's why it is.
What do you do when you got a fire that is up Glacier Park and into Canada and on state land and private land along the border?
Boy. Yeah, it is a controversy. And it could burn onto the tribe, too. That's what it did a few years ago. Thank you.